Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here this morning. As you can see, the semester is over and the campus is very quiet. In fact, I don't see students at all. Everybody goes away. I think one of the greatest traditions of Rice University is that all our students are to go out and engage the community in internships and field work and field research. And so the semesters are short. And they end at the end of April, early May. So the students have 3 full months to engage the community, and that is part of Rice's education. I think it's a great tradition. The consequence, however, is that our students are not here in the summer. Some of us do enjoy the quiet on campus, and then welcome the students back in August. Let me then welcome you here to the Baker Institute. It's always a pleasure to welcome you here. And I want to take a minute to welcome our guests here from the North American Development Bank located in San Antonio. Alex Hinojosa, the Managing Director of the North American Development Bank, welcome. And Calixto Mateos, the Deputy Managing Director of the North American Development Bank. This is a particularly interesting time to be engaging in a conversation on the Nad Bank and its place in the binational relationship in the coming decades. As you know, the North American Development Bank was created 25 years ago and has been working on with border communities to ensure that the wealth that the North American Free Trade Agreement produced, and it is much, as I mentioned this morning in a private conversation, Mexico is now poised to be the #1 trading partner of the United States, surpassing Canada. Canada had hosted that position for decades, and now Mexico is moved up, replaced China, and it's moving up to replace Canada. And that tells you the importance of institutional development at the U.S.-Mexico border. And the Nad Bank was created to make sure that all the negative externalities created by this economic integration did not have a very deep impact on border towns, and border towns and borderlanders. And I myself am a borderlander hailing from the El Paso Juarez area. So I know what the added traffic and the added congestion and all that can create on a border town, the added pressure, in addition to all the population that moved quickly in the 90s and 2000s to border towns to take advantage of this added framework for economic activity. So all of us who lived on the border for decades know exactly what it means, what NAFTA meant for the border, and of course the importance of these institutions created to make our lives easier. Indeed, I think the creation of the Nad Bank to ease that burden on us borderlanders, the added burden of all this activity was visionary, even if in many respects it was a response to the opponents of the North American Free Trade Agreement. From my perspective, and I have taken a very hard look at the institutions that govern the U.S.-Mexico border, the region is really starved for stronger governance, especially binational governance, which is nothing but the product of stronger and more vital institutions. Pamela Cruz, our research analyst at the Mexico Center, and I are just finishing a project on the institutional development of the U.S.-Mexico border, counting and assessing the state of all the cross-border institutions that provide governance on the U.S.-Mexico border on many different aspects. And I can tell you that our finding is that the border is institutionally underdeveloped. So we require more institutions like the Nad Bank. And indeed, the Nad Bank stands with very few other institutions, perhaps the IBWC, International Boundary and Water Commission, that have endured for a long time and are now needed more than ever to ensure that our two countries, the United States and Mexico, continue to build partnerships, programs, and projects that are responsive to the needs of both peoples in the coming decades. And by the way, 15 million people now live right up against the border. 7 million on the Mexican side, 7.5, and 7.5 million on the U.S. side. That's the size of a small country. In many ways, the Nad Bank stands right up against this inertia on the border of just doing without strong institutions. The border is an exceptional place, and it requires more of that. We can only wish that its scope and funding be expanded to take on the many different challenges that are still ahead of us at the U.S.-Mexico border. I have no doubt that the experience of the last 25 years and indeed have indeed prepared the institution, the Nad Bank, to grow and to take additional challenges, which is not to get our politicians to do it, to take on the challenge of expanding this important institution as well as other institutions. And this is the reason why we are here today, to engage with enthusiasm in this conversation and to talk about the future of the bank under the new trading arrangement, which we all hope will soon replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, that is the USMCA, if things go well with the tariffs and that dispute going on right now, being negotiated even as we speak. So we begin our conversation. And let me introduce to you then our panelists, Alex Hinojosa, the Managing Director of the Nad Bank, and Calixto Mateos. They will speak for a little while, and then we will engage in a conversation. Hopefully a very productive, intimate conversation on this institution. I'm not going to read the bios, they're in your program, but I'm very, very happy to welcome both Alex and Calixto to this panel. So Alex, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Payan. Well, good morning, everybody.
You can speak from there or from here. Do you have a presentation here? Either way.
Okay.
He'll manage it over there for you.
Okay. All right. Do we? I'll go up here so we can.
Yeah, so you can see it.
See that. Good morning, everyone. Okay, good. And do I advance here?
Yeah, you can manage
All right.
it there.
First, I'd like to tell you what it is we do. We have a mission that is actually a binational agreement that was signed along with NAFTA back 25 years ago. And our mission is to preserve, protect, and enhance the environment through the financing of infrastructure. Easy enough. So most people will say, well, what is infrastructure? And we will get into that. First, how have we worked? Well, we have investment by both the country of Mexico and the country of the United States. We were given some $405 million. That's million, not billion. 25 years ago, we took that money, we issued bonds, and leveraged that in the capital markets, and that's in the dollar markets, the European markets, Norwegian, Swiss francs, and have issued loans to the in the amount of $2.5 billion. But we've also leveraged outside capital from other banks, pension funds, other funds, and so on, and equity investment to attain $8.5 billion worth of projects. That was the total investment of the projects. So to leverage that, that's almost a 1-to-21 ratio. And I'm very, very proud to say that that is something that not many folks can do. We've also managed $660 some odd million worth of money that came from the EPA for grants specifically in three areas: water, wastewater, and waste. If you think about the communities along the border, especially in certain areas that are not away from the larger cities, you do have communities that are maybe sometimes grant dependent, a little poor, and needed grant money to be able to do things. So you've heard of colonias along the border. You've heard of these rural communities that did not have water and wastewater. So what have we done? You see here the areas that 148 projects in water and wastewater. We have water conservation, some 24 projects. Stormwater, and stormwater is becoming a bigger issue now with a little bit of the climate change and the growth of the communities. So there is a need for flood control as well as just dealing with stormwater. And many times it's an opportunity to recharge aquifers and to use the stormwater for potable water. We've done 25 projects in solid waste, meaning closing down illegal dump sites and opening up good landfills with membranes and proper coverage and gas capture and so on. We've done biogas and biofuel facilities, 3 of them, where they turning excess fats and other products into biogas. We have solar energy that we've done in both the United States and Mexico. First started with utilization of the programs that were in place in the United States. And I should say what we do is we definitely take the lead or take the leadership of the governments, and we utilize the programs that those governments have to push projects. We did that with solar and wind when those projects were being promoted and there were tax incentives for that. And then when Mexico got into its energy reforms and implemented new public-private partnership rules, we used those to get projects done. So that's why we have a lot of solar energy and wind energy projects, energy efficiency, and air quality. Air quality is an area that can cover a number of things, from industrial scrubbers, from industry to transportation, vehicles, both buses as well as trying to avoid having personal vehicles. So those are the types of projects that we've done. Currently, the way we funded, we've got about $1.29 billion in loans on the U.S. side and 1.8 billion on the Mexican side. So it's pretty well distributed. That changes depending on what's the most active type of lending that we're doing. Okay, so our financing, the way we've contracted, you've seen how it's grown. I started at the end of 2010. At the bank, and at the time I was the deputy managing director, and Jeronimo Gutierrez was the managing director. He was the Mexican representative. I was the American representative. He went through his term and had the pleasure of going on to be the ambassador to the U.S. from Mexico. And after he left, I became the managing director, and now Dr. Mateos is deputy managing director. So that's what basically our time has happened. We've gotten to a point where we have you see it up there, the $660 million of EPA grants during that time, but the loans in the blue of $2.4 billion that we've accomplished. We've also started a program for grants for small communities in the areas of water and wastewater that comes out of our own retained earnings. Because we are profitable, we're self-sustaining. Nothing gets funded to us to operate us at the bank. We are self-sustaining. But we have monies left over that we can use sometimes to help these small communities that sometimes don't have water service. Okay, where do we invest? We're the border bank. I know our name is a great North American development bank, and you would think it would be the whole continent, but it is basically just the border region. 100 kilometers into the U.S., 300 kilometers into Mexico. And it's very evenly distributed, the projects, amongst all the 6 states in Mexico and the 4 states in the United States. So you see the different types of, on this slide, street paving, biogas, biofuel, water, water conservation, solid waste, all along the border, and very evenly distributed. And during this process of the USMCA negotiation, we talked about expanding our geographic area. We've talked about expanding sectors, but that's where it stands right now, and with very, very good results. We've done some 23 water treatment plants that have been set up for folks, many times for brand new service. 37 water distribution systems. These are the lines to get the water out to folks. And in fact, not included in this numbers, but working right now, we've got a couple of large desalination plants working on the West Coast in Baja California. Some that are going to be one of them is going to be as big as the one that's in Carlsbad, just north of San Diego. We have 55 wastewater treatment plants and 92 wastewater collection systems. This has been a big factor. Wastewater treatment in Mexico was at about 22% back in '94 when we were established. Right now, it's almost equal to the United States at about 89%. That is twice, and this is in the border states of Mexico. That percentage of coverage is twice what it is in the rest of the country. So you can get an idea of the impact that the EPA grants and our work have accomplished. 23 water conservation projects in irrigation districts. Every day with the water negotiations and the water flows from the Colorado, the Rio Grande, the Conchos, all of that is becoming a bigger issue to deal with. And if you can work on water conservation projects for irrigation, you're helping with a solution there. 14 municipal landfills that were built or expanded, and 12 dump sites closed. We are pushing also right now with every time I get a chance to talk to a governor on the border states of Mexico, I'm pushing for organization for waste. Most of the time, in most states, it is in the property tax that you get charged for, or they have funding for waste or solid waste. As you know, most of you here pay a monthly payment for waste collection. So that's what we're pushing, is to have a funding source so that we can get things done. If people have a funding source, then the city has money, and the city then can borrow from us, and we can finance landfills. We've done 16 solar plants with 337 megawatts of generation, and 12 wind farms with 1.7 gigawatts of generation capacity installed. When we started in Mexico in wind and solar, there was nothing of utility scale outside of Oaxaca. And down in Oaxaca, it blows like crazy because it just flows from one ocean to the other. But there was nothing. We did the first ones in Tamaulipas. We continued to do projects in Chihuahua, Sonora, and even in the Rumorosa of Baja California. That's on. We're very, very proud to see in California, we have in the Imperial Valley below sea level some wind farms that we've financed. And up on the Rumorosa at 4,500 feet, we have some projects that generate electricity, and they're within 7 miles of each other, but they're on 2 different countries, and they're producing wind energy for a very large population. We've done 2 biogas facilities, including methane capture from landfills and waste to energy, and we've done cogeneration with 3 megawatts of combined energy, combined generation capacity. So this is continuing to help in other types of biogas. 7.9 million square meters of roads that have been paved, especially in the western states, because of the lack of paving and a lot of traffic problems with respiratory ailments were common for children and the aged. So we've done paving in Tijuana, Mexicali, Juarez. So a lot of paving. Continuing on the impact, the 94 million gallons a day of new water treatment capacity for drinking water. 340 million gallons a day of new or improved capacity for wastewater treatment. These numbers are all the equivalent to 3 times the size of a city of the size of San Antonio. That tells you how much out there. And a lot of these are smaller communities. 473 million gallons a day of sewage collected and treated along the entire border. And because we have shared waterways, this is very, very important for the Rio Grande, for the Tijuana River, the Colorado River, and so on. 107 billion gallons of water savings estimated per year. We all know climate change is affecting us. The water flows from between the two countries are a problem. So if we can work on water savings for irrigation or for water use in urban areas, it's a positive thing. 3.2 million metric tons of per year of CO2 emissions. We've displaced those emissions, and we have 692,000 passenger vehicles from the roads that have been taken. That would be the equivalent. That would be in air quality. That would be 14 communities with less vehicular dust, or that would be the equivalent of 703 low-emission buses in circulation. In fact, we have 703 low-emission buses in circulation. To the land, 38 communities with improved waste collection and disposal services and 2,000 tons a day of waste disposal capacity that has been installed. We're very proud of that and think that we have a big impact. Now, there's still plenty to be done. So we know that normal infrastructure, renovations for utilities, replacements of lines, all of that could easily be $500 million a year. A long time ago, I worked with, as a banker in municipal finance, I worked with the city of Houston, city of San Antonio, Chicago, LA, and San Antonio as an example. Their renovations or their replacements of their utilities on the water alone is about $100 million a year. So that is something that we see needs to be done and is part of our need for capital increase. Infrastructure along both sides of the border is getting old. Everybody has heard it, both in the U.S. and in Mexico. Aging infrastructure is a problem. If you think about it, water lines have maybe a 40-year useful life. Sewer lines, maybe 30-year useful life. So if you're operating a city where the water lines and sewer lines are 1.5 times or twice that age, you're going to have issues. Stormwater drainage, solid waste, the streets are a continuing issue. We have the need to maintain them. Stormwater is getting to be more of a problem. Solid waste. On the U.S. side, I don't know if you've heard of the non-point pollution regulation that the EPA has implemented. This is trying to get the cities to clean up the trash as well. There is that need. And so our first ever capital increase in 25-year history is being requested. Most of the other development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Chinese Development, African Development, they come in and request additional capital about every 5 years. Ours, this is the first time that we're going in for it. Why? Because we took what we had, we leveraged it. I mentioned the 1-to-21 ratio, and that is, you can only go so far. And once you start over leveraging yourself, you will start getting hit by the rating agencies, and we're trying to manage that. We try to manage. We have a AA plus, well, just one notch short of perfect. AA from Fitch. We have a leverage ratio, as I mentioned, 1-to-21, but we've been good stewards of the monies. Our loss ratio on loans is less than 1/3 of 1%. I think it's we're very proud of that. And finally, we know that in the USMCA, it was included, and we're looking forward to perhaps additional sectors, perhaps additional things that we can do under this new trade agreement, and I think we'll find out exactly how it all gets resolved. But we've been in the mix, talking to the negotiators to try to get some additional money and sectors for the Nad Bank, because we're very, very proud of our story, and we're very happy here to tell it. So at this point, I guess I'll pass it on to Calixto, and Calixto, you can talk about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for the Baker Institute. Thank you for Rice University and your presence here. And I'll go a little bit more on taking on what Alex said of our capital and what we have done with our capital. As we saw it growing our reach and working, we were very conscious about our financial ratios. So up to the certain capital we have, we shouldn't go above certain thresholds, because that could endanger our risk rating, and it's part of our operating way. I mean, to have a very good risk rating, issue bonds with that, and then and then with that we will lend and do our projects. So what we have done is first I want to show you a little bit of a timeline in Nad Bank, and I just want to pinpoint it. The treaty was signed in '93. The treaty that makes Nad Bank a bank, an international finance institution. But it was not until '94 that we started operations and getting the headquarters and everything. But then, if you see, it was not until actually, where's the here? '97 is where we have the first loan established and the EPA grant programs. So it took almost 4 years to start lending. But then it also, we learned a lot of things on how, where is the thing here? Oh, here. Does it look? No.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, so we have the growth in our institutional was because we had two institutions at the beginning, the Border Environment Economic Commission and Cooperation Commission and the Nad Bank, and we were like sister institutions, one in Mexico, one in the US. And we were supposed to be the financing arm of the projects certified by BEC. But we had first two boards, separate boards for one and each institution, and that made the coordination very complicated and the decision making very complicated. So that's part of the reason during 10 years it was really hard to get to do something. After that, the board decided that it was better to have to expand the mandate, to change the treaty so that the board would be the same for both institutions, and they approved that in 2000, but they only initiated in 2003 the charter reforms, and that's when the Mexican Senate approved it, and that's when in 2004 the U.S. Congress approved that change. So 10 years after that, we have to do a change in the bank. Now we're able to work, but it's up to that time that the bank starts really lending. And then, it's like in 2010, we have the first divisions. And from that, the portfolio, that's when Alex and Geronimo came into the bank, start growing steady. So by 2012, we have the first joint certification. I mean, even though we were integrated, we kept integrating with the BEC, and up to 2017, where the board decided to merge BEC within Nad Bank. So we do have all the functions of BEC within ourselves. We just have one board, and the process of governance of the bank is simpler, and the process of decision making, which was one of the problems, it's also improved highly. So so that's more or less how the bank came to be, and maybe the lesson here is that if you want as an institution that's able to do all what Alex just said, I mean, the results we've had, it is through a long time, and there's a long learning process, but now we are an institution. That's the reason we think increasing our capital, increasing our reach, it's just the right moment for doing that. So in terms of the capital, as I was saying, we do care a lot about our rating and our financial ratios. So what we have done is we have been very conscious in the way we use our capital, and we have tried to innovate in a ways where how can we leverage more capital from other sources, and how can we make our capital have more impact. So one of the things we have, I mean, the first thing is in market terms, we do have longer payback periods. We go up to 25 years when we lend. So many commercial banks don't go that long. We do bring a lot of private capital in our projects. We normally structure it. We normally try to be the lead arranger, but we do not get the full ticket, let's call it. So we share it with some other banks. But banks like it because we do a good due diligence, and they know that we are very serious in what we do as well. So that's the reason we are able to, by leveraging the capital, we're able to participate in very big projects. As Alex was mentioning, one of the biggest solar farms in Latin America we're part of it. We're part of it, but we are actually an active part of it. And we are also, as we have evolved, we have a structure and administrative agent services. So we're able to administer the loan for the syndicate, for example, and we get a fee out of it. And it's important because, as Alex was saying, if we have more earnings, then we have a higher possibility of doing some grants out of our own earnings to support the communities that we are focusing on. So and then we have innovated, and as Alex was saying and mentioned in the breakfast, not here, sorry. we innovated in a way that we issued last year the first green bond. And you might say, well, you know, if the mandate of the bank is to finance environmental infrastructure projects, that would be like, I mean, why should you issue a green bond, you know, because you already are a green bank. But the truth is that, well, we were doing, in a way, you know, environmental, social, and governance concerns since our establishment. But it's now the academics have bring this term, and now it's like they have some rules on how you can be a green bond or an ESG bond or whatever. So we have to adapt, and but it was really easy. So we said, okay, in order to be a green bond, we will have to show that we have eligible sectors in our lending, and we came out, and because of these rules of what's green and what's not, paving, there's a debate if it's green or not. So we said, well, you know, 86% of our projects are in the eligible green bond sectors, and so So that was the easiest part. The second part, we need, well, which sectors are you? The main sectors, I mean, we have 5 sectors. This is we didn't have the paving here. But we have drinking water, we have wind energy, we have wastewater treatment, we have solar energy. So those are clearly green bond sectors. So we said, well, we're going to devote whatever we issue on this, and we're going to, the use of funds are going to be in projects only on these sectors. I mean, here's a little bit just to state which are the sectors that the green bond framework allows. And then the green bond framework says, well, you have to have a process of how you approve and how you check and everything. And that was something that it was embedded in the way we operated. So it was really easy just to show that our project, first we determine the project type. Then, of course, we have to see that it's in our region. Then we need to assess the environmental benefits. Then we go to another assessment of the technical and financial feasibility of the project. We get to the public comment, which is another thing. I mean, there's public involvement in any of the projects we approve. We have to have a period of public comment. And then we go to what's called the certification, which is actually presenting it to the board and having the approval of the board. We cannot finance anything that's not approved by our board. So that's a very strong control, let's call it, because we need to present it there. The board needs to analyze it, and then they will approve it. And as Alex was saying, we have on the board top agencies. I mean, we have a Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, they have the EPA, and the counterparts in Mexico. So they take some serious review of our projects. And so it was easy. I mean, we have that, and this is a little bit of our lending process. We normally, and I want to highlight from this. I mean, it's of course we have the request that they want some lending. We review the project. We do the financial and credit risk analysis. But one thing that's very important is our due diligence. We go into the financial, the legal, the insurance, the technical, the fiscal, and the environmental due diligence of each project. Then we sign the contract, and we implement it. And in the implementation, there's another thing, because we do a lot of project oversight. And we also do follow up on how the disbursements are done, and that they follow competitive processes in terms of how they assign contracts and everything, and in Mexico and in the US. So that's also one part that the bank contributes and brings, and that's what other banks like. I mean, we take care of that. We really follow each project. We know what's going on. We have visits, constant visits. We have engineers there, our own engineers that are checking, and that has allowed us to be very preventative in whenever we see something's going wrong. We start working on it, so the project will really end up working and generating revenue, and that's maybe one of the reasons our loss, non-performing loans are just minimum. We just have one actually, which is non-performing, yes, but we work on it already. It's already paying, but until we don't have at least 2 payments, we don't take it out of being non-performing. So, but in technical, practical things, we have none right now. So, and you know, I mean, there's always risks in this business, and it's hard to keep it that way. So we've been lucky in a way, but we've been very thorough in our analysis and due diligence to make that not an issue. So and then, you know, once we have the project done, we do a lot of loan and monitoring of the project, because in the way we operate and in our process, when we present the project to the board, we also say what are the environmental outcomes and results and impacts that we expect from that project. And it's on those grounds that they authorize it. But then 1 year after the project is finalized, we do check if how close are we to those goals and if we're on track or not. So we have that report, and we have a very good record on that as well. I mean, not everything is 100%, but we are above the 80% in what we reach on the stated goals, and in some, of course, it's 100. So we do that, and that's part of our measuring. The results measuring we have, and then after a few years that we work on several projects in different regions, then we do an impact assessment. Well, how much have we been able to improve or be an impact on such communities with these projects that we finance? And of course, I mean, we cannot claim everything, but we do have enough evidence to show that our contribution has been valuable, and that's has been not only valuable. I think sometimes it's just been the key contribution to those things. So that's the way we work. One other thing that we innovated was as Alex mentioned also, we are working with Mexican pension funds in a vehicle. We are the first ones to issue an investment vehicle that the pension funds in Mexico will be able to fund, and it becomes a way of how we can co-finance projects. So we can have a project that's big enough. We won't get in the full, but we will give half of it to the pension, to the SECADE, which is the vehicle, and then the pension funds in Mexico will be able to participate in projects, and we're the first one that's a vehicle of debt instruments. I mean, it's of loans actually. So that, I mean, we have we will leverage our capital. We'll bring additional resources. Of course, the SECAD is very happy because we're the ones that are bringing the projects to them. We also already did the due diligence, and although it's an independent decision body, well, they take into consideration what we do, and then that allows us to get into more projects and of course bring to the market a long-term financing product. Where not only us but also. And that's one of our roles as a development bank, is to be the demonstration effect. This is the first one, but we don't have to do them all. But once we show that it works, many more commercial banks will approach and do it the same. So that's part of our role, and that's one of the things we've done. So just to finish, we already formalized it and funded. There's 4 billion Mexican pesos to the SECADE, and we have to. We're starting to be providing the project so that the funds will flow in the next semester or so. So that's the way we work, and that's what we have attained. And again, any questions, whatever. I mean, we will sit, but we're open to questions and more clarification.
Yeah, let's take a few minutes for questions. Colleagues, if you want to take a seat. And then Jennifer Fornham has just told us that she's not going to be able to make it to the panel. So we'll take a few questions, and then I will invite David Gantz to join us here, do his presentation. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll move to the final panel while we have lunch. So we just slight modification, but I think we can have a good conversation in a flow. Yes, sir.
So do I understand that the management of the NADB has no discretionary authority for making loans, and that everything has to be approved by the board?
Yes, everything.
Why such a heavy structure when every bank operates on a much more expeditious fashion?
Well, because yes, the way it works is that we do all the work. We propose the financing to the board, and they have to agree. And they do two things: they approve the financing, which is typically not that big of the issue, but they approve the certification of the environmental benefit, and that's the bigger component. But we are a development bank, and so that is our lot in life.
Perhaps because it is government. I saw another hand before that, and then over there. Yes, sir.
I could probably do the math, but your typical loan is what amount anyway? 10, 15 million, 20 million?
We have quite a varied size of loans because a small wastewater treatment plant, 25, 30 million, a little water plant maybe 10. But if you get into renewable energy, you're talking about hundreds of millions. And in those cases, we're doing a lot of co-financing. We are taking very small percentage of the total loan, but we are bringing in other players and bringing in, leveraging capital, which is part of our mission. But yes, maybe if you average it out, we might be in the $30 to $40 million loan. But there is a varied. Our maximum that we can lend to a private sector is about 110 million, and we have done some of those. To the public sector, we can go as 140 plus million, and those are single obligor limits. But we can go as low as 2 or 3.
Thank you.
Yeah, from what you know already, or are finding out, what do you think it will be different under the USMCA versus NAFTA?
Well, that's a good question because since it's not finalized yet, there are certain things that need to be figured out as to how they are going to be done. We were a side agreement to NAFTA. We were an agreement, not a treaty, but we're binational, we're not trinational, such as NAFTA is. In the new agreement, one of the big topics is environment. And the environment has been brought into the body of the USMCA. So I don't know if they're going to do an update to the side agreements. I think, though, that from our mandate in, as I said, preserving, protecting, and enhancing the environment through the financing of infrastructure will continue. But the question then is, in what area and for what type of infrastructure? So those are the questions that we still have ourselves, and we're waiting for them to have some resolution. Yes.
Thinking outside the box, in terms of U.S.-Mexico relations, and that President Lopez Obrador has proposed the need for large-scale economic development programs to address the actual underlying causes of the immigration crisis, and the Trump administration, at least in some ways, has indicated a willingness to collaborate in that effort, not just in terms of Mexico, but also Central America. It's been suggested before in other contexts, but could not the bank be expanded? You're talking about orders of magnitude. Because it's already a bank that's set up as a bilateral bank between the U.S. and Mexico. It already is engaged in collaborative efforts. Why not take this existing institution and transform it into a institution, again with private interests and so forth coming in, partnering and so forth, to build large-scale infrastructure into southern Mexico, into Central America. You get the drift of what I'm proposing or suggesting here, because I think it's really critical, because we do have to think outside of the box, or we're just going to be at loggerheads, and I don't think anybody wants that. So that's what I would raise.
I think that's a good comment. It wasn't a question. but essentially, I guess I ended the statement to the prior question that what is the geography and what are the sectors. So basically, that's the next piece. And in the discussions with the negotiators, we did say we would love to do telecommunications. We would love to do ports of entry. We'd love to help with hospitals and other things like that. So yes, when we've had a chance to talk to the staffs of the negotiators, those are some of the comments. Now, in terms of geography, what we proposed was, expand maybe to the
Border states.
Yeah, the whole border states instead of just the 300 kilometers, 100 kilometers, because I think there's a huge need there. But I will say that within the halls of D.C. somewhere, a number of folks, both administration, Congress, and others, have talked about expanding the bank to help with Mexico's southern border. That we would probably say, let's do it. We'd love to tackle it. However, that's not our decision. We have also had visitors from Canada from time to time to come visit with us because they were really impressed with what we were doing in the area of energy and air quality. So we'll see.
Before I go to the next question, let me ask you, just to understand, the environmental labor concerns were side agreements under NAFTA 25 years ago. So you were created as part of that side agreement. But now the environmental mission has been integrated into the body of the USMCA, which is to replace NAFTA, but you will remain a side agreement, or will that, how exactly is that going to, this is kind of a structural issue. How do you see that being resolved
I think as treaties or agreements work, they stay in place unless somebody replaces them. The more important thing is, what do you do, what is the mandate to do with the environment? Along with us, the CEC, the Commission on Environmental Cooperation,
which is in Montreal,
was formed, and they were to resolve issues related to making sure that no country had weakened their environmental rules to be able to have trade, but also to deal with environmental issues along the border. They have never really kind of been out there, knocking down the doors to try to get their mission accomplished in that specific, the way it is framed right now. We don't know what's going to happen. But the question that we have posed to the negotiators is, well, did you put some teeth into this? Are they going to work differently with regulators? So I think that the bank continues as is, because of the previous agreement, and unless there is there can always be two agreements that overlap each other. So ours continues, but what's in the body of the USMCA could have other efforts and missions as well.
I guess the concern that I would have is that it took so long for the bank to get really some steam and started, because I didn't know the timeline that Calixto just presented to us. And so it seems to me that it took a while for the bank to actually get to implement its mission, all the different arrangements, everything that had to come before, and then now you're facing the possibility of our political class moving it around again. So you may have to slow down to understand what's going to happen, and then it may take a while to start up again. I think that's a big issue. Raul, and then there's a couple of other questions here. Yeah.
I'm Raul Hinojosa, professor at UCLA, who actually wrote the original proposal for the North American Development Bank and worked with the administration 25 years ago to create it. So one thing I'd like to say actually is that it's already way beyond the border. There is, right now in the agreement, which is a separate agreement, which is not contemplated to be a part of USMCA. What's included in is basically how do you manage environmental and labor dispute mechanisms now inside the agreement. So it will remain and still remains outside. But there is an explicit discussion for all geographic areas in North America today, and must, by the way, every new appropriation that will happen with the Nad Bank must address those non-border issues. There's a 10%, there's a formula for how that is done. Interesting thing, the United States chose to implement a strategy of labor employment adjustment. Over $500 million was spent actually on job creation throughout the United States, counties throughout the United States. The Mexican side, we don't have a clear sense of what that resources were spent on. However, what we're in fact suggesting is exactly what the gentleman was saying, that right now the most important adjustment issue going forward is not that much of labor displacement as much as labor market integration through immigration. And there, I mean, you may be familiar with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. They have explicitly suggested, as a number of other people have suggested, that also Central America come in. So I think this is a very interesting moment for this. I can just tell you, I just got a call invited to Tijuana on Saturday. The president of Mexico is going to Tijuana, calling for a large rally to talk about how to resolve the issue. I mean, I think, you know, the moments in history are very boring and then very intense. I think we're in one of these very intense moments in history where, you know, the questions about how we need vision at this moment and how to resolve the integration of trade, migration, and remittances. There is a great story here, a brilliant story that the Nad Bank has been able to achieve. It can play a critical role at this moment where we have this major impasse once again.
Yes.
I have two questions. Number one, do you have any problems with federal American laws as far as money laundering, moving funds back and forth across the border? Number one. And number two, here in Texas and other states, we have something called PACE funding, where environmental projects can get tax abatements. Does Mexico have an equal type system over there to help leverage your projects?
Yes, sir. We have, on the first item, a very strict, a very rigorous process for reviewing all funds flows. And because we have the agencies that I mentioned on our board, we do a very thorough checking of names and companies, et cetera, to make sure there is no money laundering. We have subsidiaries in Mexico that also have to go through that. And so, yes, very much so. Now, on the second topic, we have PACE as one of the projects, or one of the programs that we have implemented as well. I'm sorry to say we haven't financed one yet, but that was done about a year and a half ago. And in our region, we have El Paso and Willacy County and Cameron County as the counties that have done the allowance to put because it's basically what you're doing is you're taking a company's taking on a loan, and then instead of having the loan on their balance sheet, it's a tax. It comes in with a tax bill. So we have that program implemented as well.
Does Mexico have a...
No, Mexico has no similar program.
Okay, here and then over here. Mm-hmm.
Yes, my question relates to the point he made. Do you ever collaborate with OPIC, since they have a broader swath geography that can cover the whole country?
Absolutely. We have co-financed with them, but because they do not have boots on the ground in our region, we're often the ones who bring them in to help co-finance. And that's to be able to just leverage more outside dollars. OPIC has a bigger region, obviously, and bigger funds.
Southern Mexico.
Right.
Here.
Maybe everybody already knows the answer to this question, but in case these tariffs happen, what kind of impact will it be on those people that owe you money? I mean, because they'll be hit hard. I mean, the only one I can think of right off the bat was your solar panel business. I mean, I guess there's a conversation going on.
Well, because we're typically financing infrastructure, it's not as a direct of a hit as a business would be. But right now, we do not foresee any impact that would have a financial effect on us.
Here.
Carla Bass with Argus. On the Representative Cuellar's proposal to use the bank to also finance natural gas pipelines, how will that work with the bank's environmental mandate? And then also the natural gas pipelines, there's been a big build out in recent years. The ones that are delayed now are delayed more because of indigenous, different community conflicts or technical problems. So how would not a lack of financing necessarily, so kind of what's the need for?
That was kind of a great question for Jennifer Fordham, who's not going to be able to join us, but that was her topic, I think, in the panel. Unfortunately, she can't make it.
Well, let me tell you this. Solar panels are excellent. They work very well, but they don't work at night. The wind doesn't always blow. So the intermittency of renewables need another source, and natural gas is the perfect complement to renewables. In fact, from previous administrations and even in this administration, at high-level economic talks, the use of natural gas has been always a component. Some have said it's a transition. Others have said it's just a baseline. What we do know right now is that it's very necessary. Storage of electricity is not at the level that we would like it to be. It's still very costly. So we see it as a very necessary component in getting a cleaner environment. Studies have already been done, and we can point to some of these that show that in the U.S. emissions have dropped significantly because of natural gas. So what we're trying to do is Mexico has the use of coal on the border here in Coahuila. And they have combustóleo, the dirty diesel plants operating as well. And under the plans of the energy reforms and others, they're going to try to avoid those and replace those. And additionally, the way the energy reform restructured dispatch, the cleaner energy generation gets used first. So our board, to kind of finish the response to the question, our board has told us that bring us on projects, and on a case-by-case basis, we will approve natural gas.
I think at a time when President Trump has been talking and the Democrats have been talking about an infrastructure bill, and when Mexico is trying to pay attention to infrastructure, whether we agree with President López Obrador's priorities on infrastructure, and I think they're wrongly placed, but the need and the acknowledged need is there. This is a very valuable instrument to push just that agenda on a binational basis, and I'm not certain that Mexico City or Washington fully understand the value of this instrument. Let me invite our Will Clayton Fellow, Dr. David Gantz, to the podium to do his presentation. We'll continue the conversation, and then at about 11:15, we'll move to the Doré Commons and have lunch and hear from Congressman Cuellar, who's been one of the champions of the bank, and Ambassador Tony Garza, who will join him in a conversation. So why don't we do this presentation, and then we'll continue the Q&A with David added to the panel, and then we move on to... Yeah, do they have the PowerPoint? They don't have it? Can we do that? Let me, while you do that, David, if you give it to him, I'll take that question, and then Lisa can help you upload it, and then we'll go. So.
Sorry, I just feel I have to make an observation here. It almost took 14 years for you to, after the establishment of the bank, to really get the gears moving. And it appears very obvious that you have an extraordinary governance response time issue. It's also clear that there are increasing demands on what you do, and yet you have increasing constraints on your ability to do it. And it seems to me that that has to be broken away, and you need to have some degree of discretionary authority to act the way every bank does, so that you can respond to some of these increasing needs. I mean, to me, that would be the greatest thing that could happen to the NADB, would be a relief from what I view as extraordinarily constraining governance on the part of the board. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
I think we totally agree with you. We do face those constraints. We do have a strong discussion with the board in terms of we were in the middle of a strategic plan and pinpointing that particular part. The governance and the decision making gets stuck sometimes, and it even more so with this conflicting times, let's say. So we've mentioned it, we've said it, but sometimes what we feel is that our board works within the charter, and for changing that we need to change the charter, and it has to come from the legislative process. As I said before, being in a forum like this is very important for us, because that's where we can get maybe the support from you to get into your congressmen, to senators and everything, and help us get that support to move it to the direction it has to be. And I mean, as we work here in the US, we work also in Mexico. We cannot do lobbying because we are a public entity, but we can address the public, and you can do the lobbying.
I have a quick question. I'll take that question in a second for you, because you said something that was interesting to me, and I'm not sure I understand it, right? Because I'm not in the sector, and I don't understand all the ins and outs and all the details of this. But you mentioned that each country had committed X number of dollars, but the U.S. and Mexico have only disbursed X minus 60% or 50%. So Washington and Mexico City committed X number of dollars, and they haven't, 25 years later, they haven't even dispersed what they committed to 25 years ago. So you've had to leverage only the trickle of money that the two countries committed in the first place. Is that what you're requesting on this capital, this addition of capital, or are you adding to that number in the hopes of receiving something? Can you clarify that capitalization aspect of it?
Yeah, no, this is something that's peculiar to the development banks, and in the Inter-American Development Bank, African Development, Chinese, all of those are different, because this is the way it works. A country will commit X amount of money, but they will have two elements to that: paid-in capital and callable capital. The paid-in capital is actually paid to you, and you have it in your your bank, and you use it. The callable capital is there to help you in case you get into trouble. You've heard of the full faith and credit of the United States government, and that term used. Well, basically that means that they're standing behind you. And in our case, it's not the full faith. It's up to only to $3 billion. Partial faith. So it's the backstop that is there. And in our case, that money can only be used to pay off our loans, our borrowings. So and that's one of the reasons why we have such a high credit rating.
Partial faith and credit. I've never heard that before. Yes.
Follow up on his governance question. I'm curious, if someone brings you a request for financing, how long does it typically take before you get those funds in your bank?
We are actually a very, very fast development bank, and I feel proud to say that. Because we deal with the end users, the big banks, World Bank and others, they lend to sovereign governments, to the country. We lend to the city of Mexicali. I mean, that instead of going from Mexico to the state and then on to, we deal with the end borrower. So we work quickly. And that is also part of I don't know if you heard the frustration here in my colleague's voice, is that none of the other development banks have these agencies on their board. They have Treasury because they're the ones who oversee the World Bank, and all the other development banks that I mentioned. None of them have EPA or the State Department. So it is, I can understand how it looks kind of odd, but that's the way it was set up originally.
David, the floor is yours, and then we'll continue our conversation and move on to the main floor for lunch and the final panel. Yep.
Thank you, Tony. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I particularly appreciate the opportunity to learn a heck of a lot more about Nad Bank. In a sense, we're doing this in what might be considered the reverse order. The panel discussion that we were going to have says the evolution of the Nad Bank, and I'm going to talk about the antecedents and the early operations, and then we have a big jump here to what's actually going on today. In many respects, the reason we have the Nad Bank goes back to 1965 for the maquiladora system. It was partly political because of the concerns that NAFTA would bring in increased border industrialization and therefore more pollution. From a very practical point of view, there were potentially 6 or 8 House of Representative votes that Mr. Clinton desperately needed to pass the Nad Bank in November of 1993, not the Nad Bank, the NAFTA legislation. And I won't spend very much time talking about the early objectives because those have already been covered pretty well. I think there's some interesting procedural aspects, particularly if you're interested in public administration or law. And then the future, I think most of that's already been covered, so I won't spend much time on that as well. Border pollution problems in many respects have gone on for decades, if not for over a century. But the biggest change that took place was in 1964, or 63 and 64, where the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations decided to get rid of the Bracero program. These were temporary workers coming in to the U.S. There were a lot of human rights issues, and they stopped it. So the question became, what are all those people going to do if they're not picking lettuce or working in the Central Valley? And so Mexico and the U.S. came up with a border industries program, which was designed to host assembly industries in a 20-kilometer stretch along the border. There are a whole series of reasons why this worked, which I won't get into unless people have an interest in it, but the end result of that was over 20-some years, an installation of about 2,100 assembly factories, the movement of over 500,000 Mexican workers, either refugees from the Bracero program or else coming up from elsewhere in Mexico. Many of them were their families, and what you had is about a 60% growth, and this is up until 1990 or 91 in Tijuana, Mexicali, Nogales, Ciudad Juarez, and other cities, and it created a very substantial increase in industrial water and air pollution, as well as a demand that was unmet for clean water, sewage, and other things like housing, which really aren't the Nad Bank's problem. There were efforts before this to deal with border environmental issues, but I think it's fair to say they weren't all that successful, in part because they were hardly funded at all. So it's not surprising that the initial scope of the Nad Bank and the BEC, when I was dealing with these issues, you had the 2 separate institutions that have been merged, but really only recently. Clean water, sewage disposal was one of the most important issues. The estimate then was $8 or $10 billion would be required. We've already heard about the fact that the governments, in their wisdom or lack thereof, did not ever produce the kinds of funds that really would have been helpful. But the concerns expressed in the U.S. in the agreement, as you may remember was negotiated in 1991 and 92 by the first Bush administration. It was signed in December 1992. Mr. Clinton came in. He decided we needed side agreements on environment and on labor. And then they decided even further down into the middle of 1993 that you should have this bilateral agreement to try to deal with the concerns not only of members of Congress, but groups, environmental groups, Hispanic groups, primarily but not exclusively on the U.S. side of the border, who figured that if you had brought 500,000 people in with the Maquiladora program and you made it much easier for American companies to invest in northern Mexico, it would get much worse unless you did something to deal with that logical increase in pollution. They came up with the Bilateral Development Bank. Hopefully we'll hear more from the person who really developed the idea, but certainly part of it was based on the European Development Bank, which was material in bringing Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and later the Eastern European countries up closer to the level of the Western European countries. I think it's fair to say the Nad Bank was never really given anything like the scope of the European Development Bank, and certainly never the billions of what are now euros, to make those changes. You know, if, in retrospect, one really wishes that had happened. You might well argue that the huge disparity in wages between the U.S. and Mexico today could have been significantly ameliorated if the U.S. had done something like what the European Development Bank did with the countries that I mentioned, but it never really happened. Large commitment of capital, very little of it paid in. Again, I don't have the knowledge or interest in duplicating the very good presentations you've had on these issues in the last few minutes. But there is some interesting part in terms of the background. The initial proposal was to separate the banking functions from the certification and project development functions. Part of that, I think, was political. There were many people who said development bank is an oxymoron. Banks have to make loans that can get repaid, which obviously they have done an extraordinarily good job of doing. But there were concerns that it would be better to separate the functions, notwithstanding some of the bureaucratic problems that this caused. So the Nad Bank would do the banking part of it, putting together. I think from the outset, the idea was you'd have to use seed money. You would never have enough money to do these kinds of projects with, what, $200 and $410 million in paid-in capital. And then you had fairly wide scope. It covered almost everything, as you can see here: land acquisition, site preparation, design, construction, rehabilitation, all of those nice things. But one of the things I think is important, you know it if you live in Texas or you live in Arizona the way I do, is a lot of these border communities on both sides of the borders are very small. They're not large cities. And in terms of developing these 10, 15, 20, $50 million projects, you need help. You can't do it internally in Naco or some of these border cities in Arizona. So you have a professional group, the Border Environment Cooperation Commission, to assist in this project proposal, create it, analyzing, implementing. All functions which could probably not, in most respects, be done with existing staffs in some of these, even Nogales, 30 or 35,000 on the U.S. side, and today about 300,000 on the Mexican side. You don't have the skills in order to do these. So without the BEC, or with some function like the BEC, I don't think any of this would have succeeded. I think it's also worth keeping out some of the other background. There were some proposals at the time to have the International Boundary and Water Commission perform many of the functions of the BEC. That was rejected for a number of reasons. The IBWC, which had been around in one form or another at that point for almost 100 years, was basically run by engineers. It dealt mostly with border demarcation, some flood control, and I think one or two sewage control plants. But the parents of the IBWC were the Ministry of Foreign Relations and the State Department, both organizations which at the time were not known for their high level of transparency. And I can speak a little bit from personal experience because from 1970 to 1975, I was effectively the general counsel for the U.S. section of the IBWC as part of my responsibilities in the State Department's legal office. And so I think the IBWC had a bad rap, probably not fully deserved, of lack of transparency and lack of political sensitivity. So the idea was to have a separate organization. When the process first began, and one of the reasons it took 3 years for things to get started, is the first set of operating regulations for the Nad Bank and the BEC were, to use a technical legal term, a public relations disaster. It was a very non-transparent process. There was a huge firestorm, particularly among the congressional delegations that had supported NAFTA because of the Nad Bank, and as a result, everyone went back to the drafting board to do a new series of regulations. The second set, particularly for what we were 1995 at this point or so, I think at the time was a model of transparency, particularly given the fact that the State Department and Foreign Relations and Treasury, again, not models of transparency generally, came up with a process which was really widely open. And again, I can speak partly from my own experience because I went to one of the first BEC hearings in Nogales. I think it was in early 1996. It might have been later, but I think it was January 1996, where you basically had the board of the BEC, and I think representatives of the bank as well, basically allowing every stakeholder who wanted to say anything to come up and make a presentation. This is not the way typical bureaucracies work. So I think one could argue that in the legacy of the Nad Bank, one aspect was a level of transparency which 25 years ago was quite unusual and I think quite praiseworthy. So a lot of the hurdles and difficulties that have been mentioned by my much more knowledgeable colleagues really haven't changed entirely in 25 years. But think about it a little bit from a practical point of view. You have a lot of small border communities, both sides of the border. You are not going to be, even if you can collect monthly fees for water and sewer, it will not cover the costs of construction, the repayment of the loan, the interest payments, and maintenance of the operation. So you're going to have a piece of the project, whether it's 10 million or 50 million, is going to have to be grant money, either from the Nad Bank or from the governments or from somewhere else, because otherwise you will never be able to service a loan. Needless to say, this is one of the great successes of the institution. You had a default rate of less than 0.03%. I mean, that's probably better than any banking institution, public or private, anywhere else in the world. You also have a culture where, particularly in Mexico, as in much of Latin America, there's no history of monthly payments for sewer and water, even for people who could probably afford them. And again, as I mentioned before, there just isn't any way in which some of these border communities, I think of a little town called Naco on the Arizona-Mexico border, could possibly develop these programs without a huge amount of technical assistance, which the BEC provided. And there were a lot of complaints, particularly in the early 4 or 5 years. This process takes too long. The point is, when you start putting together the Nogales water and sewage plants, the design phase, the analysis, bringing in the experts that you need to try to deal with what the capacity is going to be, that process takes at least a couple of years. And even if the Nad Bank can put together the financing quickly, from the time you start the project to the time it's actually operating, 4 or 5 years is not at all unreasonable. And I think people have learned this over a period of time. Needless to say, other projects in the United States, we are already well aware. Try sometime to put in another power line from Nogales to Tucson. We've been talking about that for 20 years in Arizona. The environmental issues are real, but they take time to resolve, among others. So let's see. you have a better sense, I think, than I do here, but I don't remember much public discussion of the Nad Bank at all in the negotiations. As far as I know, there's nothing in the treaty that deals with it directly. And I haven't looked at the draft implementing legislation that was sent up to Congress a week and a half ago, so I don't know if there's anything in there at all. I'm not sure whether this is good or bad. There are an awful lot of challenges to various aspects of USMCA, some of which I think are more valid than others, and maybe not having it as part of the package will end up being something of an advantage if you can get Feinstein and Cronin to deal with these issues separately but effectively. Who knows? Obviously, any sort of U.S.-Mexico or U.S.-Mexico-Canada collaboration and cooperation, whether it's USMCA or the old NAFTA or the Nad Bank, depends these days on factors that, shall we say, are not only beyond our control, but sometimes very hard to predict, as what is going on today with the proposed 5% tariffs on every Mexican import that in theory is going to occur in, 4 more days. Maybe yes, maybe no. There are many, as has been suggested before, who say we ought to try to use the Nad Bank structure since it's here, since it works, obviously with a huge expansion in function and in funds, to try to deal with the root causes of the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which, if successful, and it obviously would take a long period of time, might encourage investment and other improvements which would somewhat discourage migration to the U.S. border. And I think one of the advantages of using the Nad Bank is because you have so much experience using seed money to put together packages. Unfortunately, I don't see a great deal of enthusiasm for this. At one point, a few months ago, the Trump and the Lopez Obrador administrations sounded as if they were willing to do some sort of joint economic development projects in that part of the world. More recently, the Trump administration has cut off all USAID funding. So essentially, we're going backwards. But the idea is still a good one, and who knows what Mexico and the U.S. will agree that they're going to do with regard to these threats of higher tariffs, but I think you would have to be extraordinarily naive if you thought anything that was going to be a short-term fix, other than simply stationing a good 100,000 or so American soldiers on the southern Mexican border, is really going to deal effectively with the problem. So hopefully some in Congress will come back to the Nad Bank and say, well, this would be a good vehicle. It's already Mexico and the U.S. There's a structure, there's a track record that's superb, and maybe we could use this to solve what at least many in the U.S. and certainly the president seems to think is our most important national security problem at present. Thank you.
So based, let me see, we got about 15 minutes before we move to lunch. So let me ask you, based on this and in this history and conversation, what do you, Alex, foresee the future of the bank to be in the next quarter century? If you were able to kind of cast your eye, the shadow of the future, a little bit, it's taken 25 years to get here. The record is finally beginning to pay off. Regardless, what do you think the next 25 years will bring? I think David sent us back to the 1960s and the Maquiladora program, and then NAFTA, and so there was already kind of an understanding we got to address these issues. What are the issues in the next 25 years, and what do you think the bank's future will be?
Okay, good question. Dr. Payan, I think that we can look at our strengths and we can say, okay, if it was up to you guys, what would you do with those strengths? We have very, very strong stewardship of funds, good due diligence, leveraging capital fund, bringing in so much private money. And that would be something that, yes, both governments have talked about strengthening development banks. This administration has talked about an infrastructure bank. And I think our model has proven that, you know, it can be done. We've done a good job with leveraging and bringing in infrastructure. So I think that for the future, there will be folks who look at that. Our model, though, just, you know, kind of follow up with what Dr. Gantz was talking about, is we look at lending rather than granting funds, because in all cases we're trying to work on the model of cost of service. What does it cost each person, each company, to receive service for water, for waste, for electricity, all these infrastructure things that we have? Some are a little bit more on you know, the municipal function, like paving and streets and lighting. Some are directly related to what you do. How much water do you consume? How much wastewater you consume? So the model of cost of service, I think, is a good one, and we try to continue to use that for services to the communities. And similar with, you know, Mexico has the federal electricity system, but they're breaking that up, and we have also a very good model for public-private participation for those types of services. So the electrical commission of the whole country says, I'm not going to generate, I'm going to let these other companies generate electricity. But they have to have, they're private companies, they have a profit motive, they have efficiencies, but they need money. And so I think that could be something that could be utilized into the future. One of the tasks that well, let me kind of step back. My background was I was an investment banker in municipal finance here in the U.S. for many years. For the city of Houston, well, let's say for the city of Goliad down the road here, to issue bonds, they had an independent engineer, a financial advisor, a bond counsel, others, folks who were a team, an external team that could help them define the project and come up with a solution like that. That's what I function in. And on the Mexican side, that doesn't exist. We many times are the ones who are developing the project, figuring out finances, and bringing it sometimes even through the state commissions to get their approval, the state legislations to get their approval. So there are changes that are going on to try to make municipal finance in Mexico a little bit more efficient, and we're going through that process. The one thing that sort of slowed us down is, yes, the BEC was supposed to be doing that, but because it was disjointed, they never did. I don't think we have one loan that was generated by the BEC. It was most of the time something that it was always generated by the bank. So the process of being the consultant for the communities is key. And what we're proposing is working with the IBWC a little bit more. The IBWC is a bunch of engineers who know the needs of the community. Of course, they have just the border region. It's a little bit more tied to, but they do have a number of technical folks who can develop the needs. And in my view, and the way we're proposing it, it shouldn't be a one-time thing. Oh, I need a new wastewater treatment plant. No, it should be a program of capital needs for 10 years. 5-10 years to say, I need pumps, I need valves, I need lines replaced, I need wastewater treatment plants. And okay, they define that because they're the technical people that can do that, the engineers. We then come in working hand in hand with them, and we say, well, here's how you can finance it. Get these projects in first, then the next ones, and so on. And then now you have a financial plan, a solution for 10 years or 5 or whatever you want to do. But that's the approach that needs to be done, because you have, if you can do that every year ongoing, you will always have improvements in the works. What's happened in the past was up until a couple of years ago on the Mexican side, every 3 years it was a new administration. I mean, completely new. So the continuity of the planning was a real problem. So helping people directly, as again, part of our model, as opposed to the other development banks of the U.S. that are working at the federal level, is I think one of the better things that we do, and looking to the future should be done. I myself, I think I'm a big proponent of local control and local responsibility. I mean, so I think as we talk to the governors and mayors of the communities along the border, they recognize that. You know, a lot of them say, yeah, we don't have the financial capacity. No, we don't have the technical expertise. That I can understand that. But if we can help in the development and then help in the financial structuring where that they will be self-sustaining and they will take on their responsibility for that, I think that's going to be good. So in terms of geography, we'd be willing to tackle it, but I don't know what the future is on that. Calix, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think you cover everything. Thank you.
I think the component of the IBWC is quite interesting because if you think about it, where are the Nad Bank's mission and the IBWC's mission intersecting? It's really coming down to the climate change, a natural resource scarcity, which is really water in the southwestern United States, northern Mexico. So this is an area where both are going to have to really just come together because there is a major crisis. I think all the evidence points to it, in spite of the debate, the public debate that goes on in the media and among politicians. I think the reality is going to be harsh. And this is where the IBWC, which is supposed to take care of these natural resources, and the bank, which is supposed to aid in the conservation and the recycling and infrastructure and so on, are going to have to kind of work together. And I think the next 25 years will show that just as there was a need to articulate the BEC, and the Nad Bank, because they were not quite working together and they were just slowing things down, I think having the IBWC and the Nad Bank also not quite working jointly may actually make the border environment more difficult. And so that institutional design or institutional redesign, I think, is going to be very important on the U.S.-Mexico border. Amen of the idea that the bank can aid in development of the southern border.
One thing that just to point out is that there are still many things that need to be negotiated and talked about. IBWC, their charge is surface water. They don't even talk or deal with groundwater.
Right.
So.
They probably had to here roll and then over here and then we got we got about 7 minutes and then we got a break. Yes.
So I appreciate the position, Alex and Calixto, that you can't make the policy of the bank going forward. But I would like you to respond specifically to the comment that there is going to be a replenishment, we hope, and if there's a replenishment, the rules are absolutely clear that you're going to have to spend at least 10% of that money outside the borders in Mexico and in the United States. If you could address that. I just wanted to say one thing about the comment that was made. We actually did go to Luxembourg and look at the European Investment Bank, separate also from the European Regional Development Funds. The calculation I presented to President Clinton is if we did that, if Mexico had joined the European Union, Mexico would be getting $100 billion, not in loans, in grants.
Like Poland did.
Yeah. Okay, so think about Mexico with $2.5 trillion of investment in rails, and we won't even go there. But there is this non-border issue that is definitely going to be a part of the bank. What are you thinking?
One
Finally, just one last. If you could address the question of telecommunications that was raised earlier.
In terms of the what's called the Community Adjustment Investment Program, the CAPE, Yeah, the charter says that up to 10% of the capital can be devoted to that by a board decision. So it has to go through our board, and they have to decide how much. So that's the technicality. It's there, yes. As you mentioned, the results over the years were very mixed in Mexico. When they capitalized us, they gave us 450 million. So 45 million were devoted to that program. 22.5 to Mexico, 22.5 to the U.S. The 22.5 to Mexico were channeled through Banobras, I think, and it was like that, it's go 22.5 million there, not knowing else what happened with them. The 22.5 from the U.S. were channeled to this program, which then was complemented by other sources of funds from the USDA and other, to make it even like 45 or 45 million program, which was able to finance and do grants for about the same amount. But they didn't leverage the capital in such a way. I mean, it's, yeah, as you mentioned, it's more like 10 times, not 20. So what we think is that if at some point there's the increase in capital, which has been approved by our board actually, and it's just following the congressional appropriation, process. Actually, Mexico put the first part of that increase in capital, 10 million, 2 years ago. So we're in that process. And then once we have it, then we can do it. But I mean, the process of acquiring capital takes years. I mean, normally it took about 10 years last time for both governments to give us the full amount of capital. It might take something like that in this case. And then it can be decided to do all the other things.
Alex,
my point on that.
Before you say something about the telecom as well, one last question I'd like to address in 30 seconds at the very end of your comments. It essentially, what can we as citizens do to get the bank better known in the public, increase public support, and especially legislative and political support for the bank? And then we'll close with that.
Yeah. Just to follow up on Dr. Hinojos' comment is that if the CAPE is refunded, or I guess whatever, I think my recommendation that it be done through the bank ourselves, because it was managed outside, and I feel proud in saying, we took the 400 million and we converted it to a capital of 2-point-something billion. Right now, there are no CAPE funds left, and we didn't manage that. So the concepts of leveraging, of the way you process, of all of that, I think would be something that I would recommend. Additionally, I'm not the one who decides this, but we were set up to deal with the environmental issues and to deal with projects, and the CAPE is a completely different charge. So at this point, I think it would take some time to re-look at what type of regulation or policy you would have to do that. Telecommunications, we would love to do that because telemedicine, education, we know that there is a huge need along the border, because they're the areas where, and the south of the United States, where into Louisiana and so on, where telecommunication access is the weakest, and obviously that's outside our area. But because of education, medicine, and so on, and business development, all that we do in lending for infrastructure, we also see as setting the backbone for economic development and creation of jobs and so on. So legislative, what can be done? I think, carry the message, as Calixto said, to your legislators, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who set the budgets, they're the ones who approve the treaties, and so carry that message that banks doing a good job. Let them do it. Unleash the power of the Nad Bank, as somebody once said. So, but that's what
Make
my
it a real North American development bank. Join us for lunch and a final panel with Congressman Cuellar and Ambassador Tony Garza right behind us here. Thank you very much.